afternoon. My name is Darla, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Noble Systems Composer webinar. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. If you should need assistance during the call, please press star, then 0, and an operator will come back online to assist you. Thank you. Mr. Jason Ouimet, you may begin your conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. As the moderator alluded to, everyone will be placed on mute. Also, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, there is a QA button that allows you to ask any questions or answers. We will leave time for that at the end of today's webinar to answer any questions that you have regarding this. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Noble Users Group website in the next few days after today's webinar. So we'd like to thank you all for joining us today for a webinar on Composer and Composer X, the latest release. The main focus of today's call will be to highlight the top features in the Composer desktop solution. So presenting today is myself, Matt Schock. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer with Noble Systems, also in charge of designing scripts for our business development team. Joining me today is Jason Ouimet. Jason is the Director of Product Management and has worked with Composer since the very first version was created. For today's agenda, we're going to begin with a history of Composer. Following that, we're going to move on to a brief overview of the top functionality in the product. This will lead us into a deeper dive of some of those top features, and then finally we're going to end the presentations with the Q&A that we alluded to earlier. So starting off with the history, Jason, as Director of Product Management, could you give us a little bit of background on the Composer application?
Sure. Composer development started back in 2005. Our original goal was to create an easy-to-use and easy-to-customize agent desktop. We wanted any user, not just a programmer, to create screens and scripts that would work for their agents. We also wanted Composer to require a minimal amount of training. Included in each use of Composer, one of the big pieces that we wanted the agents to be able to update the database. Originally, that was just updating the Noble Systems Atomics database, but as the product evolved, it opened up into updating the database with any ODBC connection. Also, as time went by, we identified that we had a need for a web-based agent. That was how Composer 9 was introduced. Composer 9 introduced a whole new screen designer. It was completely independent of our Composer 8 bit client. As a result of having two different products, our newest requirement was to unify the designers regardless if the deployment was web-based or if it was using a Windows bit client. And that's how Composer X came about. Over the course of history, one thing to note is that Composer has taken roughly 35,000 hours of development and has about 375,000 lines of code. And this encompasses both Composer, the agent API that Composer runs on, and the Noble Mimic product that Composer is built with as well.
Great. So it sounds like there's been a lot of thought and planning that has gone into this latest version of Composer. Can you just kind of give us an overview of some of the highlights?
Sure. As we discussed in the history, one of the biggest pieces with Composer X was allowing for creating campaigns with a unified designer, regardless if the agent application was a Windows bit client or if it was web-based. We also want to put in some security enhancements, so one of the big pieces that we added was a read-only policy for the Composer designer. This would allow a user to be able to see what was created in the Composer campaign, but not actually be able to make any changes. Composer X also no longer requires an ODBC DSN be configured. So if for those individuals that were concerned about having a DSN created that would provide a user access to our database, that's no longer the case. The designer directly connects to the database without that DSN. Another big feature that we added was language localization. Composer can now be localized for any language that is left to right. The localization works for the designer and both the Windows agent client and the web agent client. We also had a number of users that asked for Composer to come into focus when a call was connected. So what we did is we created a screen focus event. If a call gets connected, Composer can be configured to pop Composer into view. It can also be done for other events, such as maybe a callback notification And some users that say, hey, when there's a callback that should be dialed by an agent and that notification comes up, we want Composer to come into the focus on the agent desktop. That can now be done as well with the screen focus events. And finally, we added numerous actions and events, such as the print screen action or the callback failure event. We really wanted to take all the functionality that we were missing in Composer 8 and bring that into Composer X, so everything was unified and there was no feature gap between 8 and 9 to X.
Okay, so at a high level, some of the most important features of Composer are easy customization, easy campaign deployment, multiple client deployment options, real-time updates to multiple data sources, workflow optimization, and desktop unification. So Jason, let's start with easy customization. Can we go into a little bit more detail with regards to that?
Sure. As we talk about easy customization, I mean, big piece is that Composer X provides you a very easy-to-use interface. You can create an unlimited number of screens within a Composer campaign. There really is no limitation. All of the screen objects that you would drag and drop onto the screens that you create. Composer also provides you the ability to customize any of those screen objects. You can customize the background color, the font, the size, the location. There's additional properties throughout any object that you add onto a Composer screen. And then finally, one of the biggest pieces with easy customization is the advanced scripting. The advanced scripting allows you to customize the campaign and really build the actions that drive that campaign success. One great thing about those actions is it doesn't require you to know a programming language. As we move into the further in the presentation here, you'll see that we have a toolbox over here to the left, or all of our screens. So if you look in this black box here on the left-hand side, you'll see a campaign with 20 or so screens. You actually can't see them all within this box because there's so many. We've had customers that have used up to 120 screens. If you look also in the next slide here, you'll see that we have our toolbox highlighted. And in this toolbox, you can see that we allow for text or browser controls, buttons, checkboxes, combo boxes, data grids, list box, labels, panels, and text boxes. But one of the big keys here is that pretty much any object that you would expect to see on a user interface can be provided in a Composer screen for your agents to use. On the right here in a highlighted box, you can see the properties. In this case, we're actually showing the properties for the screen collect to. You can see that you can change the background color. If you wanted to add a background image instead, you could do so. What's the font, the color, the size? All of these properties you will see on any object that you'll click on. There will be additional properties depending on what the type of object is. For example, if it's a text box, you'll see text box validation properties. But the key is that all of the objects within Composer are easy to customize. And finally, with our last slide for easy customization, we highlight our Composer actions for scripting. One of the big pieces with scripting that should be recognized is that scripting allows you to create pretty much whatever you can think of within the campaign. Some of these actions that can be initiated, all of these actions would be initiated off of a Composer event. And a Composer event would be a click on a button, a connect to a call, text being entered into a text box, a termination of a call. All of the actions that you see in these categories right here is initiated off of these events. Actions are available to provide the flexibility for what's needed in each Composer campaign. These actions within Composer can be something such as initiating a transfer, hanging up a call, navigating to a new screen, processing a credit card transaction, creating SQL statements, maybe even starting or stopping a recording. For this presentation, we probably don't have time to go through each one of the actions that are available, but the key here is that Composer does provide you the flexibility, the control that you need.
Great. So it seems like with just a little bit of training that almost anyone can create these powerful scripts. And I know from my own experience in creating scripts, not being what I would consider a code level type guy, I've been able to do some pretty powerful things for our internal business development department with just using a tool that would just took a little bit of training for me to understand. So creating scripts seems to be really easy. What about kind of deploying those scripts into a campaign? Because a lot of our customers have multiple campaigns.
Yeah, that's a really great point. One thing that we really try to focus on with Composer is to ease the campaign deployment. One of the first pieces that we touch base on for doing that is what we call campaign substitution. This allows you to create a master campaign and save that to many substituted campaigns that will use that master campaign screen each time a call is connected. When this is set up, no longer requires a user to go file, save as, file, save as. They can use this campaign substitution so that once they make the changes in the master campaign, it's deployed to multiple. Another big piece within Composer and really puts into focus into Composer X is the validation grid. This provides an intuitive validation as to where are the errors and warnings for objects that may not have been properly configured. So when you save a campaign and you push it out to for use for your agents, you don't have to be worried that there's some kind of object or that's not been properly configured within Composer. And then finally, we added in the backup and restore functionality. We're going to talk about this in more detail with the slide, but basically it allows the users to easily roll back to a previous version of Composer campaign that they may have created. In our next slide here, we're going to show you the campaign substitution. In the campaign substitution, the user can select a master campaign, which is what you see here up top with the IPIL, and substitute any campaigns that they would like that screen data to show for those calls. So IPIL is the master campaign. If a call connects to auto, it's going to show the screens that were saved for IPIL. Again, as we discussed a little bit earlier, this prevents the user from having to go file, save as for each of their campaigns. Next slide, we're going to show our validation grid. In this piece, we actually have two warnings. No errors, that's a good thing to see. And this user did not define an initial screen for their campaign. They also didn't define an inbound query. Once the user set up both of these items, the validation grid would be empty, basically indicating that this campaign is safe to use for use for their agents and can be deployed out to the floor. And finally, we'll talk about our backup and restore functionality. Each time a user saves a campaign in Composer X, it's going to prompt them to enter notes as to what did they change. Many users we see don't always do that. They just click OK. We would always recommend that you put something in there because there may be a point where you need to roll back. Something you put in that campaign wasn't right, or maybe the agents weren't trained and prepared for the new changes that you put in place. In the event that that happened, you can use our restore functionality. In that restore functionality, you can go ahead and just pick one of the timestamps of when you had a previous save, and you can see the comments that you put in place, so you easily identify which version you want to roll back to.
Wow, that's some really great stuff when we're looking at that kind of stuff, Jason, as far as the backup and restore. And one of the things I really like about it from a personal experience is that, oftentimes when I'm designing scripts, I feel that something's going to work great, but an agent, when it's deployed, since I'm not working on the floor, agents don't really feel the same way I do. So it's nice to have that ability to go to back up and restore. But Jason, one of the other things that we've talked about in the past, and you alluded to earlier, was that we had the Composer 8 and the Composer 9, and one was a thick client and one was a web-based version. My understanding is that with Composer X, we sort of given the agent or the customer the option to choose between the two. Can we talk about that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. As we discussed earlier in the presentation here, Composer X has both a Windows agent and a web agent. Campaigns created in Composer can be created for web, Win, or both. There's no requirement as to putting one specific way. We would generally always recommend our customers to use both because it gives them a little bit of flexibility. Why is it important? Well, this gives users the ability, our users that do not want to invest in a web infrastructure initially, a way to utilize the power of Composer and create their campaigns. And then when they're ready, go ahead and make that investment in the web infrastructure and not have to redevelop their campaigns. For our customers that are using a web infrastructure, This gives them a little bit of a disaster recovery type standpoint. If your web server goes down, for your LAN-based agents can then use the Windows stick client as a failover recovery while you're bringing your web-based infrastructure back up and online. Also, one piece that we don't necessarily have a slide for to show you, but we did want to talk about is easy upgrades for web-based Composer deployments. A secondary website can always be created for new versions of our Composer standpoint or product. So if we have a new product or a new version of Composer X that you'd like to have installed, but you're kind of worried that there may be issues, one thing we can do is create a secondary website running that version. While the rest of your floor is using the previous version, a few agents can use that secondary version to build your confidence level up and eventually move the newest version into the full production site. Another note is that Composer 8 and Composer 9 can run simultaneously with Composer X. So the group of agents working one campaign, one or two agents of that large group can be working on Composer X while the others are working on either Composer 8 or Composer 9. In the next two slides here, we're going to show you an example of an agent running Composer X in a Windows agent, and then an agent running Composer X in a web agent. And you can see in these examples, there's not really much of a difference between the Windows agent and the web agent. The only real difference you may see is that the title bar shows that we are running in Firefox or our web browser rather than just the big client. But essentially, the screens look exactly the same.
Wow, great. So that seems to really provide a great deal of flexibility. And I also understand that with this latest version of Composer X that we've really increased the ability of Composer to interface with outside resources, such as databases or applications.
Yeah, that's right. One of the big pieces with this, and one of when we talk about getting data from all their sources, number one that everyone always usually uses is database connectivity. And by default, we support direct database connectivity to Atomics, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and PostgreSQL. We also support connectivity using a generic ODBC driver for unsupported data sources. We also notice that there's a new trend coming into the marketplace where a lot of companies are not allowing direct database access. And what they allow for is connectivity via web services. So what we've added to Composer is push and pull data using web services. Now, our current version supports RESTful-based web services. And in this presentation, you're actually going to get a sneak peek of our new version of Composer X 2.0, which is actually due out next quarter, in Q4 2012, which supports SOAP-based web services. So as we go further in the presentation here, you'll see that we have a database connection builder. It's quite simple. The user simply needs to pick the connection type and then specify the connection details necessary to build the connection. And you can see here that we have a selection from Atomics, MySQL, a generic ODBC, Postgres, and SQL Server. Within web services, we actually have two actions. You'll see one here called HTTP Web Service. That's our RESTful web service action. And then in our next version, we'll have a SOAP web service. And the way that will work is that we'll actually define a web service in the campaign where we can specify a WSDL from a URL location, or actually take a flat file WSDL that may be on your PC and identify the methods that are available within that WSDL. On the right, you'll see the properties for configuring that, which is, which web service are we going to call, which method are we going to use, and what are the inputs and outputs. And, this may sound all very technical. The key point here is that Composer gives the user the ability to use cutting-edge technology for data exchange.
Great. So it sounds like we've got a lot of options when it comes to interfacing with other databases, application. We've talked about ease of deployment and things of that level. But what about the tools that are going to help the agents through the workflow process?
Sure. Composer will really help in allowing the agents to say the right things. You can create screens to make sure your agents stick to the script, create screens that say the mini Miranda. I mean, how many times do we have agents that, we tell them to say the mini Miranda, but they don't actually say it? So we can create screens that won't allow them to proceed unless they say it. Another big piece is making sure that they input the data that's required. A lot of times agents see a screen with a bunch of text boxes and they don't always fill out everything that's needed. With Composer, you can ensure that they're filling out the data that's required and in the order that we'd expect them to. Also within Composer, we have data validation. Data validation will allow us to validate on things like credit card numbers, ABA routing numbers, date validation, and also validate that we have an valid email address. We also have contact management. Contact management is a way for us to work a pool of accounts with a group of agents or a specific agent. We'll talk more about that in more detail as we get further down here in the presentation. Earlier, we had talked about creating the script or creating a mini Miranda that will force that your agents read it. You'll see an example here in a script where we say, please note the call may be monitored or recorded. We require that this was read to the caller. So below, there's nothing for the agent to see, but if they click yes, then that information would pop up. In the next slide, you can see that that agent did click yes, and so now we have a new tab control with billing and shipping info. Now, when we talk about data validation, in this example, the text box for email address was configured to make sure that we have a valid email address. Well, in this case, the user forgot to enter a domain. They just entered ted@ted, which isn't a valid email address. So when they tried to proceed by entering in the credit card info, it would not allow them to proceed, and it highlighted that text box in red so that the user knew that they needed to go back and correct that input of that data. Our next slide here kind of talks about our data input and controlling data input. This actually came from one of our customers. We had a customer that I had actually worked with that we were working on building his Composer campaign, and he really wanted to control the workflow that the agents were putting in the correct data in the correct order on their screen. So what we did is we used the text changed event to change the background of this text box from white to green. So each time they entered in the data and they moved to the next piece, in this scenario, name is green. When they were done putting in the name, address would change to green. And after they put in the address, city, state, zip would change to green. And it was a really elegant way to control and show the agents what we expect to get inputted. If some of that information was not needed, we would just skip past them and skip to the text boxes that were highlighted to green. Well, we'd also talked about from a workflow optimization standpoint to use contact management. As we discussed earlier, contact management provides the agents the ability to work owned accounts or pooled accounts and easily identify which of those accounts they've already worked. In this screenshot, you'll see a data grid, and it's quite a colorful screenshot. The key here to notice is that when they click on a record in this data grid, the information at the bottom of the screen will pop up with the information that pertains to that particular record. For example, all of the phone numbers, the home phone, the work phone, the co-borrower, the cell phone, etc. They also have actions to trigger additional pieces based off of that information. They can launch an additional application, send a letter, etc. Another piece with the workflow is if your agents are working these pooled accounts, who's worked what? Well, Composer gives them a very good view as to what has been reviewed and what has been worked. In this example, you'll see that the agent has worked a record, the first record to completion, so it's highlighted in red. The agent has also reviewed the next two records, but didn't actually complete the work on them. So it's displayed as reviewed with a gray color. This color can also be configured within Composer. So they'd be blue or yellow, whatever your business needs are. But the agent will then know that, hey, I've already looked at that. I need to go look at a different account that's white that's not currently being worked.
Great. So it seems like there's a lot of tools that the customer can use, and essentially at the end of the day, it seems like it can just really build an application to not only guide their agents to the phone call, but to ensure that we're collecting the right data. But Jason, what about customers that have their existing applications that they need to use within the call center?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that kind of leads into where some of the real power with Composer is, and that's desktop unification. We allow the user to unify the desktop with many tools. First and foremost, what we talked about earlier is direct database connectivity. Many users have a system of work that may have an open database that we can go and acquire data from. and which would not require the users to use that front-end application anymore. We could do all of the database interaction directly within Composer. Another big piece, if that database is closed off, is launching external applications. The agents or these users can run Composer and their other applications side by side, and Composer can then be used to pop those external applications with the correct information. We had already talked about web services. This is a new piece that's really coming in the market space. So a lot of applications are supporting communication via web services, and that's a piece that we have within the product line. Another big piece for desktop unification is unifying multimedia communication. With the use of our ERMS product, you can unify SMS and email communication right within the product. And then finally, we have a number of users still in this day that are using old 3270, 5250, or VT100 terminals for their agents to interact with their system of work. We created Noble Mimic to get around those challenges. Noble Mimic will allow the users to read and write to those 3270, 5250, and VT100 terminals. As we go down into database connectivity, as we talked about, if your application has an open database, we can connect to it. And we can run selects, we can run updates, we can delete records if needed. Hopefully there's not much of that. We can insert new rows. But all of those things can be done with as long as we have an open ODBC driver, or if it's one of the 4 main supported databases within the product line. We talked about popping an external application. You'll see in this example we have an action called launch executable. And to the right we see the properties of that launch executable action. What we're doing is we're actually launching our ERP application here at Noble Systems, and we're passing it the account number. We're passing an argument when we call that executable. And what that'll do, we'll pop that application right into the agent's view, popping the right account number. A lot of times, many of our users will use our WinScrape product to do this, which will scrape data via keyboard commands over. But it's one way to really have a desktop unification so that the agents aren't double entering data. They may also use WinScrape to bring over disposition information from Composer over to their other applications so they're not double entering notes or double entering dispositions. We had talked about earlier using web services with either SOAP or RESTful type web services. Our expectation is that, in some scenarios, like for example, we have a couple customers now that use RESTful web services to gather all of their data that Composer needs just by using the account number. So we do a web service call with the account number. We gather all of the data via that web service. And as the agent proceeds moving through that campaign, we call web service calls to update the data. So as we gather information in text boxes, if they select items from combo boxes, all of that information is then passed to the other application to update their system of work using web services. We briefly talked about unifying multimedia communication with email and SMS. Using our ERMS product, an email can be sent into the Composer agent application with the context of the email, who the email was from, who it was to, what was the subject that the emailer sent, and what was the body of that message. And to cut back on your agent's typing time and increase their productivity, you can easily choose a reply from a drop-down box and build in canned responses that can easily be chosen by your agents and send those responses off very quickly. In this example here, you see an email that come in. Next one is an SMS. We received an SMS which was converted to an email. And that SMS allowed the user to then pick a canned response, as you see here in the middle of the screen, and that canned response would then send a response off to the user that sent the SMS in. Finally, from a desktop unification standpoint, we talked about Noble Mimic. Noble Mimic allows users that are using TN 3270, 5250, or VT100 terminals to read and write. When we created this, we really wanted this to be a big desktop unification tool. A lot of our users that are using Noble Mimic were using these old legacy systems, but also wanting to introduce a new system for their agents to use. It became quite expensive for them to train their users on both systems. The legacy system, the users had to memorize 350 keyboard commands. The new system required learning a whole new UI. With Composer and Noble Mimic, we could bring that all into one application. We could create a nice, easy-to-use graphical UI for the users so that they didn't have to interact with the emulation window. And from the new application, we can bring that data in by directly connecting to that database with ODBC or with web services, and the agents can work from one unified screen, therefore cutting back on the training costs for your agents so that we can get the agents trained and on the floor and using the system right away. Additional unification types. One piece that people have used in the past as well that we've seen within Composer is using our web browser control in Composer. What they'll do is they'll put a script on top of the Composer screen that they expect the users to read while popping their web-based application in a web browser control below. Therefore, the agents don't have to switch it back and forth between windows or have two different windows open. They're using one unified screen, and they can ensure that their agents are seeing the script material that they want them to read, such as a mini Miranda or a sales pitch. Any of those items are clearly in their view, right in their screen, with the information that they should be inputting or working with down below. And that pretty much finishes our top features of Composer and leads us into Q&A.
Great, Jason. That seems like there's a lot of great stuff there. So we do have a couple of questions that people have asked of us. The first one being is, what is the migration path from Composer 8 and Composer 9 to Composer X?
That's a really good question. Users using Composer 9 have a direct migration path. The Composer X designer was built right on top of Composer 9, so you don't need to be retrained on how to use the designer. The applications can easily be migrated from Composer 9 to Composer X. Unfortunately, there is not a direct migration path from Composer 8 to Composer X. However, you can talk to your sales account manager or solutions engineer, and they can help guide you through some of the pieces that we can help speed up that process and move you over into Composer X.
Okay, so that's another question we have, Jason, is it seems like one of the strings there was an action item in the drop-down list for Salesforce. The question is, do we have a Salesforce.com integration?
We do. What it uses is we have a piece called Manage Credentials so that the users can go in and specify their Salesforce credentials within Composer. And then on each call, when you call the launch Salesforce action, we can pass or pop Salesforce into the agent screen, passing the agent's credentials and popping the correct Salesforce account number.
Okay. We've got a couple of more questions here. Jason, this one come in for the script. When requesting, for example, credit card information, that data in the credit card field will be saved to the database, correct?
Not necessarily. That field for specifying credit card number can be masked. That's one big piece to note. It doesn't have to be shown completely. And then on top of that, it doesn't necessarily have to be saved to the database. As we talked about, that database, that can be sent via a web service call. It can be saved to the database if it's your requirement, but it is not an absolute requirement to save that credit card information to the database. You should be able to use other web service calls, maybe a payment processor information, so that it's not retained in our system, which would then bring PCI compliant concerns.
And additionally, Jason, couldn't they, in fact, map that field to one of their own databases in another application like we alluded to earlier as well?
Absolutely. They could use a direct database connectivity to another system and update their other system and insert that credit card number into another database instead of the Atomics database.
Okay. It looks like we have another one here. What does the SMS and email capability require us to have in order to receive and send emails and SMS? Is this an add-on product?
It is an add-on product. It requires that you have our Noble Systems ERMS product. This is another one of those items that if you're interested, I would encourage you to reach out to your sales account manager or your solutions engineer so they can help give you a presentation and discuss the functionality so that you can use that in your enterprise.
Okay, well, that seems to be all the questions that we have regarding the system. If there are additional questions that come up or we didn't get your question today, we do encourage you to reach out to your sales account manager or your solutions engineer and discuss with them, maybe getting a more in-depth demo that may address some of your specific questions. Also, once again, just as a reminder that this will be available on the Noble Users Group website recording, so if there's anything you missed or you'd like to review it again, please log into the Noble Users Group website. Those of you who haven't joined the Noble Users Group website, we encourage you to do so. There's a lot of good information there. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this. That is going to end today's demonstration.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.